Map. No one spoke first, and that silence did not feel awkward. It felt deliberate, like a held breath stretched just long enough to force truth into the open, and Emily Carter stood there with a calm that did not belong to the version of her anyone in that room thought they knew, because she was no longer reacting, she was choosing, and that difference changed everything. Richard recovered quickly. He always did, his expression smoothing into something controlled, something acceptable for public spaces. His voice measured as he stepped slightly forward, creating the illusion of leadership. In a moment he did not fully understand Emily, he said her name like a question disguised as familiarity, as if this encounter were unexpected, as if timing alone were the issue and not the reality standing between them. But Emily did not answer immediately. She let the moment expand just enough to make his composure work harder to maintain itself, and in that brief pause the woman beside him straightened subtly, her posture sharpening, her smile adjusting, not fading, but refining itself into something more precise, more defensive, without appearing. So Emily finally spoke, her voice even quiet, but clear enough to cut through the surrounding noise. I was wondering how long it would take before I saw you together. She did not raise her tone. She did not accuse. She simply stated what already existed, and that was what shifted the balance, because statements do not invite denial the way questions do. Richard exhaled through his nose, a small, controlled gesture that anyone else might have missed, but Emily saw it and recognized it as calculation, not confusion, not regret, just calculation. The woman turned slightly toward Richard, then back to Emily, her gaze steady, assessing. You must be Emily, she said, her tone polite, carefully neutral, the kind of neutrality that signals awareness without conceding anything. And Emily nodded once, not offering her hand, not stepping closer, maintaining the exact distance she had chosen, because space was control, and she had learned that too late in her marriage, but not too late for what came next. Yes, she said simply, and then nothing else, and that absence of explanation forced the room to lean in again, not physically, but perceptually. Conversations nearby dimmed just enough for attention to drift toward them, not because anyone expected a scene, but because something about the stillness felt unfinished, and unfinished moments attract attention more than chaos ever does. Richard shifted his weight slightly, his body angling in a way that attempted to include both women while subtly positioning himself as the center of the interaction, a familiar strategy, one that had worked for him in boardrooms, negotiations, and public appearances, but here it felt thinner, less effective, because Emily was not engaging with him on those terms. This is not the place for this, he said finally, his voice lower, now directed only at her, as if privacy could be reintroduced after everything had already been made visible. But Emily's expression did not change. That is the difference, she replied quietly. This is exactly the place for this, because this is where you chose to make it visible. And that sentence landed without force, without emphasis, yet it carried more weight than anything louder could have achieved, because it reframed the entire situation, not as a confrontation initiated by her, but as a reality created by him. And for the first time the woman beside him lost a fraction of her composure, not visibly, not in a way most people would notice, but Emily saw it, the slight tightening around her eyes, the recalibration of her stance, as if she were adjusting to a version of events she had not fully anticipated, and that was enough. Emily placed her hand more firmly against her stomach, grounding herself again, feeling the subtle movement beneath her skin. And in that moment, she was not just standing as a wife or a woman confronting betrayal. She was standing as someone who had already decided what mattered and what no longer did. Richard followed the gesture, his eyes flickering briefly toward her stomach and then away, and that brief glance revealed more than anything he had said all evening, because it showed awareness without responsibility, recognition without action. And Emily understood then that there was nothing left to wait for, no explanation that would change anything, no apology that would restore what had already been broken, not loudly, not dramatically, but completely. She took a small step back, not retreating, but repositioning, creating space, not just physically, but symbolically, as if drawing a line that had never been visible before. And in doing so, she shifted the entire dynamic of the moment, because she was no longer part of the situation, she was defining it. And as the quiet returned to the room, not fully but enough for conversations to cautiously resume, the tension did not Disappear. It settled deeper, heavier, more permanent, because everyone present understood something. Without needing it explained, this was not a scene that would end with raised voices or immediate consequences. This was something else, entirely, something slower, more controlled, and far more final. And as Emily turned her gaze away from Richard for the first time that night, she realized that whatever came next would not be about proving anything to him. It would be about revealing everything to the world. Richard opened his mouth again, as if he could still guide the direction of what was happening, but the moment had already moved beyond him, and Emily could see it clearly. Now the invisible structure that had once kept her quiet had collapsed without sound, and without warning, leaving nothing but truth exposed in its place. "You are overreacting," he said finally, his voice low, controlled, the same tone he had used for years to dismiss concerns before they could fully form, but it landed differently now, because Emily was no longer listening for reassurance. She was listening for patterns, and patterns once seen cannot be unseen. She tilted her head slightly, not in confusion, but in recognition of how predictable the response was. "No," she replied, just as calmly, "I am responding," and that single word carried more weight than anything louder could have achieved, because it marked the shift from passive to active, from endured to chosen. The woman beside him crossed her arms lightly, not defensive, but composed, her gaze steady on Emily, as if reassessing the situation with new information. "You are making this more complicated than it needs to be," she said, her voice smooth, measured, the kind of voice that had likely resolved many uncomfortable conversations before. But Emily did not turn fully toward her. She kept her focus balanced between them, because this was not a triangle, this was a decision, and decisions do not need equal attention. "It is already complicated," Emily said quietly. "You just chose not to see it until now." And that was the first moment. The woman's expression tightened, just slightly, not enough for most people to notice, but enough for Emily to understand that the control she had expected to maintain was beginning to shift. Richard exhaled again, this time less controlled, his jaw tightening for a fraction of a second before he adjusted his stance. "We can talk about this at home," he said, as if the word home still held meaning, as if it had not already been redefined by everything standing in front of them. But Emily did not respond to that word. She let it pass through the space between them unanswered, because some words lose their meaning long before people realize it, and home had become one of them. Instead, she reached into her small clutch, her movement slow, deliberate, not rushed, not dramatic. And for a moment, Richard's attention followed the gesture, his expression shifting into something closer to uncertainty than control, because he did not know what she was about to do. And that lack of knowledge was something he was not used to. Emily pulled out a slim envelope, nothing ornate, nothing designed to draw attention, but its simplicity made it stand out in a room built on excess. She held it for a second, not as a threat, not as a performance, but as a fact, and then she extended it toward him, not stepping closer, not forcing the exchange, just offering it into the space between them. Richard hesitated, not because he was afraid, but because he was calculating again, trying to determine what accepting it would mean, what it would signal to the people beginning to notice the shift in energy around them. But hesitation itself is a signal, and Emily knew that. Finally, he took the envelope, his fingers brushing against hers briefly, and even that small contact felt unfamiliar now, like something from a different life, a different version of both of them. "What is this?" he asked, his voice quieter than before, not as controlled as he intended, and Emily met his gaze steadily. "This is what happens next," she said simply, and there was no anger in her tone, no satisfaction, just certainty, the kind that does not need reinforcement. The woman glanced at the envelope, then back at Emily, her composure holding, but thinner, now more deliberate, as if she were actively maintaining it rather than naturally existing within it. And for the first time since the encounter began, she did not speak. She waited, watching, evaluating, realizing perhaps that whatever narrative she had expected was no longer unfolding in a way she could predict. Richard opened the envelope just enough to see the contents inside, not pulling them out fully, but enough to recognize their nature. His expression changed, not dramatically, not in a way that would draw immediate attention, but in a way Emily had never seen before. Not dominance, not dismissal, but recognition. The kind that comes when something carefully managed is suddenly no longer contained. He looked back up at her, his voice lower. "Now what are you doing, Emily?" And for a brief moment the question sounded less like control and more like uncertainty, and Emily answered without hesitation, without raising her voice, without needing to explain everything, because the explanation was already in his hands. "I am not doing anything," she said quietly. I am letting it be seen, and as the words settled into the space around them, the room did not erupt, it did not demand attention, it simply shifted again, deeper this time, heavier, as if the foundation beneath everything familiar had moved just enough that no one could ignore it any longer, and Emily understood in that moment that this was no longer about confrontation or reaction, this was about revelation, and once something is revealed it cannot return to being hidden no matter how much someone might wish it could. Richard did not pull the papers out completely, but he did not need to, because recognition travels faster than understanding, and whatever he saw in that envelope was enough to interrupt the version of control he had been carefully maintaining all evening. His fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the document, as if holding it more firmly could somehow contain what it represented. The woman beside him leaned in just enough to glimpse the contents, her posture still composed, but no longer effortless. There was intention in every movement, now calculation layered over confidence, and for the first time, she did not look at Emily as if she were an interruption. She looked at her as if she were a variable that had not been accounted for. The surrounding conversations did not stop entirely, but they shifted again, the subtle awareness in the room deepening as more people sensed that something important was unfolding, without spectacle, without raised voices, the kind of moment that would be discussed later in quiet tones, because no one could quite explain why it mattered, but everyone could feel that it did. You should not have brought this here, Richard said finally, his voice lower than before, not commanding, not dismissive, but edged with something closer to concern than he intended, and Emily noticed that shift immediately because it confirmed what she had already understood. This was no longer a situation he could manage privately. This had crossed into visibility, and visibility changes everything. I did not bring anything, she replied calmly. You created this long before tonight, and now it simply exists where people can see it. And again, she did not raise her voice. She did not need to, because truth spoken quietly travels further in a room built on perception. The woman straightened slightly, her gaze moving between them, then settling on Richard for a brief second, as if silently asking a question. He did not answer, and that silence between them spoke louder than any explanation could, because it revealed that whatever understanding they shared did not include this, not fully, not completely, not in a way that gave her control of the moment. Richard adjusted his stance again, this time less successfully. The balance he relied on no longer holding in the same way. We can handle this differently, he said, and the word differently carried weight because it implied options, alternatives, outcomes that could still be shaped. But Emily shook her head, once not sharply, not emotionally, just with finality. No, she said softly. This is how it is handled. And that was when something else shifted, not in Richard, not in the woman, but in the space around them, because the people closest to the interaction were no longer pretending not to notice. They were not staring openly, but their attention had settled, their movements slower, their conversations quieter, as if everyone understood that whatever was happening here was no longer private, even without a single raised voice. Emily placed her hand again over her stomach, grounding herself in something real, something unaffected by perception or power, and for a brief moment, she closed her eyes, not to escape, but to center, to ensure that what she did next came from clarity, not impulse. Because this was not about reacting, this was about finishing something that had already begun long before tonight. When she opened her eyes again, her gaze was steady, not fixed on Richard, not fixed on the woman, but encompassing both of them equally, because neither of them defined this moment anymore. Richard looked down at the envelope again, then back at her, his expression tightening, just enough to reveal the effort it took to maintain composure. You are making a mistake, he said, and there it was, the final attempt not to deny, not to explain, but to redirect, to suggest that she still had something to lose by continuing. But Emily did not respond immediately. She let the words settle, let them exist without interruption, because sometimes the most powerful response is not immediate, it is measured. She took a slow breath, then spoke with the same quiet certainty that had carried her through every moment since she stepped into the room. The mistake was thinking I would stay silent, she said, and that sentence did not echo, it did not demand attention, but it landed with a permanence that could not be undone. The woman shifted her weight subtly, her composure still intact, but no longer untouched. There was awareness, now a recognition that whatever position she believed she held was no longer secure, not because of confrontation, but because of exposure, and exposure does not require force, it only requires presence. Richard closed the envelope without removing the contents, his hand tightening around it as if instinctively trying to reclaim control over something that was already beyond his reach. And Emily saw that too. She saw the instinct, the habit, the reflex to contain, to manage, to reduce. And she understood then that this was the last moment he would have to do so, because after this nothing would remain confined to quiet conversations or private explanations. She stepped back, once more creating space again, not retreating but completing the distance between who she had been and who she was now. And in that space something settled, not tension, not fear, but certainty, the kind that does not require validation. And as the room slowly resumed its rhythm, the conversations rising slightly, the movement returning in careful increments, it was clear to anyone paying attention that something irreversible had already taken place, not loudly, not dramatically, but completely. And Emily Carter stood at the center of it, not as a victim, not as a reaction, but as the one who had chosen to let the truth exist. Where it could no longer be ignored, the room did not return to normal. It only pretended to, because once people sense a shift like that, they do not forget it. They carry it quietly, in the way their eyes linger a second too long, in the way conversations drift back to the same point, without naming it. And Emily Carter felt that change settle around her, like a current, invisible, but undeniable. She did not stay in place any longer. She turned, not abruptly, not dramatically, but with the same measured control she had carried through every second of the encounter, and began to walk away, each step steady, each movement intentional, her heels making a soft rhythm against the marble floor that seemed louder now, not because of sound, but because of attention. And she could feel it, the awareness following her, not intrusive, not aggressive, but present, the kind of attention that does not ask permission. Richard did not move immediately. He remained where he stood, the envelope still in his hand, as if deciding whether to follow or remain. But hesitation again spoke louder than action, and by the time he shifted his weight, Emily had already created enough distance that closing it would require intention, not instinct. The woman beside him watched Emily leave, her expression composed, but altered, the earlier certainty replaced by something more cautious, more aware of the space she now occupied within a narrative she did not control. And for a moment neither of them spoke, because there are moments when words only reduce what silence already explains. Emily reached the edge of the ballroom, near the tall windows overlooking the city lights stretching across Manhattan in quiet patterns that did not care about what had just happened inside the room. And that perspective grounded her again, because the world outside continued unchanged while everything inside had subtly redefined itself. She rested her hand lightly against the cool glass, not leaning, not seeking support, just feeling the contrast between the controlled environment behind her and the vast indifference beyond it. And in that moment her breathing slowed, completely steady, not forced, not practiced, just natural. For the first time that evening she was not preparing, she was not anticipating, she was simply present. A server approached cautiously, offering water instead of champagne this time, as if sensing what was appropriate without needing to be told. And Emily accepted with a small nod, the glass cool in her hand, as she took a slow, measured sip, grounding herself further in something real, something uncomplicated. "Thank you," she said quietly, and the simplicity of the exchange felt almost unfamiliar after everything that had just unfolded behind her. Richard's voice did not follow immediately, and that absence mattered more than anything he could have said, because it confirmed what she had already understood. He was not ready to engage with what had been revealed, not here, not like this. And that delay created its own message, one that did not need to be spoken. Emily did not turn back. She did not check if he was watching. She no longer needed to measure his reactions to define her own, and that shift was complete now. Irreversible. She placed the glass down on a nearby table, her fingers releasing it without hesitation, without the subtle tension that had defined her movements earlier, because there was nothing left to hold on to, nothing left to manage or contain. Behind her the low hum of conversation began to rebuild, slightly more cautious, more aware, as if the entire room had adjusted its volume in response to something it could not fully name. And within that hum, she heard fragments of curiosity, not direct, not confrontational, but present enough to signal that what had just occurred would not remain contained within the walls of that ballroom. It would travel quietly, efficiently through networks of influence and perception, the way all significant moments do in places like this, not through spectacle, but through repetition, through subtle retelling, through the simple act of being remembered. Emily exhaled slowly, her hand returning once more to her stomach, feeling the steady movement beneath her skin. And that small, consistent reminder anchored everything else into perspective, because whatever consequences followed, whatever conversations unfolded, whatever narratives were constructed, this remained unchanged, this remained real, and it was enough. Footsteps approached finally, not rushed, not aggressive, but deliberate, and Emily knew without turning that it was him, not because of sound alone, but because of familiarity, the way presence can be recognized, even without sight. Richard stopped a few feet behind her, not close enough to reclaim space, not distant enough to avoid engagement, and for a moment, he did not speak, as if searching for the right words, or perhaps realizing that there were none left that could restore what had already shifted. Emily did not turn immediately. She let the silence exist again, let it stretch just enough to make its weight clear, before she finally faced him, her expression unchanged, not cold, not distant, simply resolved. And in that stillness, something became undeniable. This was no longer a conversation about what had happened. This was the beginning of everything that would follow, and neither of them could step back into what existed before, because that version no longer existed anywhere except in memory. Richard was the first to break the silence, but even then his voice carried none of the authority it once had, because something fundamental had shifted, and both of them could feel it, even if only one of them was willing to accept it. "You should not have done this here," he said again, but this time the words lacked direction. They did not guide, they did not control, they simply existed as a reflex from a version of himself that no longer fit the moment. Emily studied him, not with anger, not with disappointment, but with a clarity that made everything simpler than it had ever been before. "You keep saying that," she replied quietly, as if the location is the problem and not what led to it, and that was the difference between them now. He was still trying to contain the situation, to reduce it to something manageable, while she had already stepped beyond the need to manage anything at all. Richard glanced briefly over his shoulder toward the center of the room, where the woman still stood, speaking to someone, but not fully engaged, her attention drifting back in their direction in small, calculated intervals, as if she were measuring the distance not in feet, but in influence and consequence, in what would remain once this moment settled back into memory. He lowered his voice further. "We can fix this, Emily," and that word fix hung between them heavier than anything else he had said, because it implied damage, but also control, as if outcomes could still be engineered, as if consequences could still be negotiated. But Emily did not respond immediately. She let the word exist. She let it reveal everything it needed to reveal before she answered. "You are not trying to fix anything," she said calmly. "You are trying to contain it, and those are not the same." And that sentence landed with a quiet precision that made it impossible to ignore, because it named something he had not said out loud, but had been operating from since the beginning. Richard's jaw tightened slightly, his composure still intact, but thinner, now stretched across something that was no longer stable. "You do not understand how this works," he said, and for a moment the old tone returned, not louder but sharper, edged with the assumption that experience equaled authority, that knowledge equaled control. But Emily did not react to it. She did not shrink, she did not adjust. She simply looked at him with the same steady gaze that had defined every moment since she stepped into the room. "I understand exactly how it works," she replied softly. "That is why I am no longer part of it." And that was when the shift became complete, not just between them, but within him, because for the first time, he did not have an immediate response, not a deflection, not a correction, not a redirection, just a brief, unguarded silence that revealed something he had not intended to show: uncertainty. He looked down at the envelope still in his hand, as if seeing it differently now. Not as something he could manage, but as something that had already moved beyond his control. "What did you tell them?" he asked finally, and the question carried a different weight now, not strategic, but reactive, because it acknowledged what he had been avoiding, the possibility that this was no longer private. Emily followed his gaze to the envelope, then back to his face, her expression unchanged. "I did not need to tell anyone anything," she said quietly. "People only need to see enough to start asking the right questions, and once that happens, the rest follows on its own." And that was the moment the truth fully settled, not just for him, but for anyone who might have been close enough to sense the shift without hearing the words. Because in rooms like this, information does not need to be announced. It moves through implication, through observation, through the quiet alignment of details that suddenly make sense. Richard exhaled slowly, the tension in his posture no longer hidden beneath practiced control. "This will affect more than just us," he said, and there was something real in that statement, something that extended beyond reputation, beyond image, into consequences that could not be easily redirected, But Emily nodded once, because she already knew that she had known it before she ever stepped into the room. "I know," she said simply, and her acceptance of that reality carried more weight than any argument could have, because it removed the last remaining leverage he thought he had the ability to warn her of outcomes. She had already considered a group of guests passed behind them, their conversation low, their presence subtle, but enough to reinforce the fact that this moment existed within a larger world. One that was already beginning to absorb what had happened, whether they acknowledged it directly or not. Emily shifted her stance slightly, not to move away, but to signal completion, not of the situation, but of her role within it, because there was nothing left for her to prove, nothing left for her to say that had not already been made clear. Richard looked at her one more time, searching for something he could still hold onto, some version of her that would respond differently, that would allow him to reframe the moment into something less final, but he did not find it, because that version no longer existed anywhere except in his expectations, and expectations do not survive clarity. Emily held his gaze for a second longer, then let it go, not abruptly, not emotionally, just with quiet certainty, as if closing a chapter that had already ended before either of them fully realized it. And in that simple release, something irreversible settled between them, not conflict, not anger, but absence, the absence of anything left to negotiate, anything left to return to. And as the city lights reflected faintly in the glass behind her, Emily Carter understood with complete certainty that what came next would not be shaped by him, by the room, or by the story others chose to tell. It would be shaped by the one thing that could not be undone, the truth that had finally been allowed to exist, where everyone could see it. The distance between them remained unchanged, but the meaning of that distance had transformed completely, because it was no longer something waiting to be closed. It was something that had been defined and accepted, and Richard seemed to understand that now, not fully, not comfortably, but enough to stop trying to reduce it into something temporary. His grip on the envelope loosened slightly, not because he was letting go, but because he no longer knew what holding on accomplished. The room behind them continued its quiet recovery, conversations rebuilding in careful layers, but there was a difference now, an undercurrent that moved through the space, not loud, not disruptive, but persistent, like a ripple that refused to disappear, and Emily Carter felt it without needing to look, because she understood how moments like this traveled not through volume, but through memory, through the subtle exchange of glances, through the quiet alignment of people who had witnessed just enough to recognize significance without needing confirmation. Richard shifted again, this time not toward her, but slightly to the side, as if reconsidering his position within the space itself, as if realizing that proximity no longer granted influence. "You could have handled this privately," he said, and even now the instinct remained. Not to deny, not to explain, but to redirect toward a version of events that preserved structure. But Emily shook her head once more, not in disagreement, but in completion. "That would only have protected you," she replied, and her tone remained steady, not accusatory, not emotional, simply factual. And that was what made it impossible to dismiss, because it did not seek validation, it did not invite argument, it existed as truth. And truth, once recognized, cannot be negotiated. The woman across the room began to move, then not toward them directly, but in a gradual arc that suggested intention without urgency, her posture still composed, but more deliberate now, as if she were choosing each step with awareness of how it would be perceived. And Emily noticed that too, not with concern, not with curiosity, but with understanding, because whatever role the woman believed she held had already been altered by what had taken place, and roles that depend on perception rarely survive exposure. Richard followed Emily's gaze for a moment, then looked back at her, his expression quieter, now stripped of the layers he had relied on earlier. "This will not stay here," he said, and this time it was not a warning, it was an acknowledgement, something closer to reality than strategy. And Emily nodded, because that had always been the point. She turned slightly toward the window again, the city stretching endlessly beyond, the glass lights flickering in patterns that had nothing to do with the room behind her, and everything to do with scale, with perspective, with the understanding that no matter how significant a moment feels within a closed space, the world outside continues forward unchanged, and that realization did not diminish what had happened. It clarified it, it placed it exactly where it belonged within her life, not above it, not controlling it, simply part of it. Footsteps approached again, this time more measured, more intentional. And when the woman finally stopped at a respectful distance, there was no introduction, no performance, no attempt to reclaim narrative, only a brief pause, as if acknowledging that whatever conversation might have existed before was no longer relevant. "I did not know," she said quietly, her voice controlled but lacking the earlier certainty, and Emily looked at her fully for the first time, not searching, not judging, simply observing the difference between what had been presented and what now remained. And she nodded once because the statement did not change anything. It did not need to be challenged or confirmed. It simply existed like everything else that had been revealed tonight. Richard did not speak during that exchange, and that silence carried its own meaning because it signaled a loss, not just of control, but of position. The ability to define the narrative had shifted away from him, and he could feel it even if he did not yet understand the full extent of what that meant. Emily let the moment settle just long enough to ensure that nothing further needed to be said. Then she turned back toward the room, not to rejoin it, but to acknowledge it, to recognize the space that had held this moment and would now carry its echo forward without her involvement. She adjusted her posture slightly, her movements no longer constrained by expectation or anticipation, and began to walk, not quickly, not slowly, but with the same deliberate rhythm that had brought her here in the first place. And as she moved, the attention followed again, not overwhelming, not invasive, but present enough to confirm that what had happened would not fade into background noise. It would remain, it would be remembered, it would be discussed, not because she demanded it, but because she allowed it to exist without denial. Richard did not follow this time, and that absence completed something that had been unfolding since the moment she stepped into the room. Because for the first time, he had no action that could restore proximity, no step that could reclaim what had been lost. And Emily Carter did not look back, not out of defiance, not out of pain, but because there was nothing left behind her that required her attention anymore. Only what lay ahead, defined by something far more stable than perception, something that did not shift with opinion or circumstance, something that once revealed could not be hidden again. The doors of the ballroom opened without ceremony, and the cool night air from the Manhattan street slipped inside, just enough to remind Emily Carter that the world outside had never paused for anything that happened within those walls. And as she stepped through them, the sound of the Gala softened behind her, not disappearing completely, but fading into something distant, something already becoming memory. Her heels touched the pavement with a quiet finality, the kind that does not announce itself, but still marks an ending. And for a brief moment, she stood there, not moving, not looking back, just breathing in the city air as traffic passed in steady lines of headlights and distant horns, the rhythm of a world that did not ask questions and did not offer explanations. It simply moved forward, and now, so did she. A driver nearby stepped toward her with a polite nod, recognizing her name from the reservation that had been made earlier, not by Richard, not by anyone connected to that room, but by her, and that detail mattered more than anyone else would understand, because it was the first decision she had made that existed entirely outside of his influence. "Yes, Ms. Carter," he said quietly, and she nodded once, her voice steady as she confirmed before stepping toward the waiting car. The door opened smoothly, the interior calm, controlled, untouched by the tension she had just left behind. And as she lowered herself into the seat, carefully mindful of the life she carried, she felt something unfamiliar settle into place, not relief, not triumph, but alignment. The kind that comes when actions finally match truth without compromise, without delay. The door closed gently, sealing the quiet around her. As the car pulled away from the curb, the building behind her grew smaller in the reflection of the window, its lights still bright, its presence still significant to those inside, but no longer central to her world. She rested her hand against her stomach again, feeling the steady movement beneath her skin, and for the first time that night, there was no weight attached to it, no tension, no anticipation, just presence, just certainty. The city moved around her in familiar patterns, avenues stretching in straight lines, intersections marking choices that could be taken or ignored. And as the car turned onto a quieter street, she allowed herself to lean back slightly, not in exhaustion, but in release, because the version of her that had entered that ballroom had been carrying something invisible, something heavy, something that required constant adjustment and quiet negotiation. And now that weight was gone, not because the situation had been resolved, but because she had stopped carrying it alone. Across town, the lights of office buildings still glowed in high windows, reminders that work continued, deals were made, decisions were taken. Lives intersected and separated in ways that rarely paused for reflection. And somewhere within that grid of glass and steel, Richard Vaughn remained still, standing in a room that had already begun to shift around him, holding an envelope that could not be unseen and surrounded by people who would remember exactly what they had witnessed even if they never spoke of it directly. Because rooms like that do not forget, they archive, they repeat, they reshape narratives in ways that no single person can fully control. And Emily understood that without needing to see it, because she had already stepped beyond it. The car slowed as it approached her destination, a building that did not carry his name, did not reflect his status, did not require her to adjust herself to fit within it. And when it came to a stop, she paused for a second before reaching for the door handle, not out of hesitation, but out of recognition that this moment mattered. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was real. She stepped out onto the sidewalk, the night quieter, here the air cooler, the noise of the city softened into distance. And as she walked toward the entrance, there was no urgency in her movement, no need to prove anything to anyone watching, because no one was watching, and that was the point. Inside the lobby, the lighting was warm, steady, unchanged by anything that had taken place miles away. And as the elevator doors opened, she stepped inside, pressing the button with a calm that no longer required effort. The ascent was smooth, uninterrupted, each floor passing without resistance, without pause. And when the doors opened again, she stepped into a space that was hers, not defined by anyone else, not shaped by expectation, but by choice. And as she crossed the threshold, she did not look back. She did not replay the night. She did not question what would come next, because some decisions do not need reconsideration, they simply need to be lived. And as the door closed quietly behind her, the city continued its rhythm outside, unchanged, unaware, indifferent, and Emily Carter stood in the silence of her own space, with nothing left to prove, nothing left to hide, and everything ahead of her defined not by what had been taken but by what she had chosen to finally let go.